protesting about their own rights, and
Yeah.
that started off from Tunisia.
Yes.
And I used that as, because, he refused, the man that young man that was burnt alive, who, his vegetable cart was seized, and then, he kind of like protested, and that was what actually spiraled the Arab Spring. And for me, when I read that story, that was back, it resonated, what Sembène was saying, that, around the world, we're now having people's liberties being compromised. Lots of people are now protesting, or in particular, not through violence or through mass collection of protests, saying we refuse to just kind of go along with the status quo.
Okay.
So yeah.
So I mean, basically, from the body of Sembène's work, what you can expect to see is certainly raising that discourse about what happens. What do you do when you're faced with an ultimatum? Convert or be conquered. And that is essentially why his work was #1 controversial, because of the times, and also it's an education in itself. Looking at the reaction of Africa, or what Africa's response, or how Africans dealt with that kind of scenario. So, obviously we're following the narrative, and as you say, a lot of what happened then we're still seeing today. So, I mean, I remember watching in one of the films, especially about about not wanting to convert, that idea of, there was like a scene of African children running along, this rural village, and then there was the same scene of Muslims praying, and the children sort of was in distress, and they were screaming and they were running, going, and they sort of stopped for 2 seconds, looked around, and then just carried on praying. And it's that dichotomy with reality of the children are in distress and they're running, and then but we've got to carry out this religion, Do
you know, I'm so amazed that you actually. I had to analyze the film, and that was one of the things I noticed, because I had to rewind, and
it's quite a striking scene.
That basically, something quite interesting. Now the reason why they actually continued to pray was because the princess, I don't know if you had been kidnapped. Now remember, this was royalty. Now for a princess, imagine, okay, God, forbid, Princess Catherine of Cambridge, is kidnapped in London. Remember the uproar.
Yeah.
Or imagine, or a royal member of a royal family. Now in that time, that was the princess, and she was apparently heir to the throne.
Yeah.
Now for that young woman to have, the imams could really have cared less, because she's female and she's royalty. Remember, God alone is king. So that's your own religion, that's your own tradition. We do not respect. And imagine, this is a foreign tradition that had come into a land that had its own culture.
Yeah.
So you now have these two cultures. That was what he was trying to
the duality of it.
The duality, where my own distress, one man's meat is another man's poison, or my distress is, so what's the big deal?
And essentially, that is what it brought.
Exactly.
That is one of the effects, that is one of the impositions of the regime. The regime,
and the attitude towards African culture, because African culture was about, about royalty, it was about kings, it was about rulers at that time, traditional chiefs who, at least were, because that was really how we were ruled.
Yeah.
But for a foreign religion to come in and really kind of turn it around, and that was the beginning. And now the king was quite distressed. His daughter had, been kidnapped, and but he was also faced with having to face this new religion where his own authority was being undermined. And what was he going to do? You know, continue with this search party for his daughter, or face this, you know, culture. So that was the kind of the like you said, the duality. You know, that was going on along all of West Africa, or even Africa at that time.
Okay, I mean, it's quite clear that I mean, what we need to do is, you know, people need to explore that, you know, those titles. Of course, it sounds, you know, interesting and just right for the times to go and take a look at. Another key point is that Sembène is actually one of the first film directors from an African country to receive international acclaim. And again, can you talk about that whole motto of, you know, waking them up, that storytelling for liberation, you know? You know, why is it that he got noticed and yet his message was so controversial?
One of the reasons I had to go back and forth, you know, looking at Sembène, and I think one of the reasons why he got notice and recognition, he's won quite a few film awards, you know, in the Palme d'Or, FESPACO, which is the biannual film festival in Ouagadougou. He's had quite a lot of international recognition abroad, and given lectures at universities in the United States. Yes, consistency. He's never wavered. Sembène never wavered. He never compromised himself, because he always said, and there's a quote that I will probably be talking, you know, about the work of an artist. He said, "What is an artist? Who is an artist? What is an artist's work? You know, is it art for art's sake?" He was writing for the people, and he felt that he could not be taking money, you know, from a government that he felt was working against his own people. So he was consistently, you know, at what I call loggerheads, but it was kind of like a peaceful compromise between him and the Senegalese government. Because I think the Senegalese government were also very, very careful about how far or what they could do with Sembène. They didn't want a revolt, an international revolt on their hands as well. They didn't want a local uprising. But how do they silence someone who actually could literally, or has actually exposed, because it was an exposition of the...
an expose.
Or expose, exactly, of the collusion, you know, and using, and like all African writers, you know, he was, you know, looking at the African diaspora, you know, and Africa, the continent itself, especially after what people had gone through, slavery, colonialism, and to think that, you know, unfortunately, there was a regurgitation, and even probably more so horrific, that this was actually Africans doing this to Africans themselves, you know. Africans doing this to Africans themselves, you know.
But okay, I'm glad that you raised that point about Africans doing it to themselves, because that then links in with the work of Ngugi Mwationgo, who's a Kenyan writer, about decolonizing the mind, because what essentially you have like a program that's inserted to the mind that stays there, grows to maturity, and then sort of evolves into something else. So a lot of that work, again, is like decolonizing the mind, because to have a healthy Africa, you do need a decolonization of the mind, because essentially, as we've explored in Sembène's work, is all those repercussions and those effects of an imperialist regime is eroding the very foundations, you know, the heart of Africa. You know, what do you do about that? In an interview mentions, you know, to do that would be to spit out global capitalism. Does that mean that, you know, and then if you do that, what does that mean to spit out your language, the language of capitalism? Why Evian water? Why Mercedes-Benz? You know, all of these are they're products, they're children of the capitalist regime. So where does that leave you?
Yeah, well, I mean, the whole idea, because Ngugi, you know, Sembène, I mean, they're coming from a particular ideology.
Yeah.
As far as I was concerned, you know, it's not about, oh, you know, do not actually own any of these things, but it's what he calls this fetishization.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we now hold this to be the true, you know? Why should we worship? Because it was this sort of like fetish, you know,
mm-hmm.
where the car becomes a symbol of who I am.
Mm-hmm.
What I wear now becomes a way of, you know, because these were all the tools that this...
that came with the, you know, with the regime, with the
regime,
agenda.
With
yeah.
the agenda. And, you know, that we are also carrying on.
Yeah.
You know, that these are the symbols of what is meant to be successful.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and of course the modeling, you know, modeling behavior
mm-hmm.
also comes into play, because when you model yourself, you know,
mm-hmm.
what you see, you know, as the standard, you
yeah.
know, becomes what you think to be true.
Yeah, it becomes the status quo.
It becomes the status quo.
The normalization of it, as they say.
Exactly. And when an authority passes on power to a particular group,
mm-hmm.
and says, well, this is what we, you know, this is what Africa should aspire to be,
mm-hmm.
but from a particular perspective,
mm-hmm.
you know, when you buy the Evian water, you know, you're actually basically increasing, you know, the markets in France.
Mm.
When you buy the Mercedes-Benz, you know, where is the money going into?
Yes.
You know,
yeah.
The whole idea is that we now see these things as symbols of African power.